Welcome back to Face the Nation. We continue our conversation with Minneapolis Federal Reserve's Neel Kashkari. Neel, let's pick up where you left off on this question of supply. When I was talking with two senators earlier, there was this debate about whether taxation on companies that don't pay a minimum level of taxation will have their supply hurt. So in other words, you tax them, supply goes down, that hurts with inflation. What's your assessment of that? Over the long term, that's probably true on the margin. People say that about raising interest rates. Why raise interest rates? That's going to make it more expensive for firms to invest, and that's going to not help with the supply side. That's true over the long term. But over the short term, the demand side effects totally swamp the supply side effects. And so when I look at a bill that's being considered that your two senators talked about, my guess is over the next couple of years, it's not going to have much of an impact on inflation. It's not going to affect how I analyze inflation over the next few years. I think long term, it may have some effect. But over the near term, we have an acute mismatch between demand and supply. And it's really up to the Federal Reserve to be able to bring that demand down. And we're committed to doing what we need to do. Help me understand recessions. There is a debate in Washington that's full of political gamesmanship. So take us inside why it matters if America is in a recession and what the component parts are that are a part of that and how that helps us understand the health of the economy.
Well, it really matters when Americans feel it. When Americans, especially in the job market, that's the most important part of the economy, so to speak, for Americans is their job. Do they have a decent place to work and earning decent wages? And typically recessions they demonstrate wide job losses, high unemployment. Those are terrible for American families. And we're not seeing anything like that. The labor market so far is very strong. We are seeing some sectors like the tech sector start to shed workers or start to cool down in hiring. But fundamentally, the labor market appears to be very strong, while GDP, the amount the economy is producing, appears to be shrinking. So we're getting mixed signals out of the economy. From my perspective, in terms of getting inflation in check, whether we are technically in a recession or not doesn't change my analysis. I'm focused on the inflation data. I'm focused on the wage data. And so far, inflation continues to surprise us to the upside. Wages continue to grow. So far, the labor market is very, very strong. And that means whether we are technically in a recession or not doesn't change the fact that the Federal Reserve has its own work to do, and we are committed to doing it.
Last 20 seconds, Neel, on GDP, when it goes down, isn't that kind of what the Fed's trying to do, slow down growth? So is that a good number?
Well, we definitely want to see some slowing. We don't want to see the economy overheating. We would love it if we can transition to a sustainable economy without tipping the economy into recession. There's not a great record of doing that. Typically, when the economy slows down, it slows down by quite a bit, especially if it's the central bank that is inducing the slowdown. So we're going to do everything we can to try to avoid a recession, but we are committed to bringing inflation down, and we are going to do what we need to do. And we are a long way away from achieving an economy that is back at 2% inflation, and that's where we need to get to.
All right. Neel Kashkari, thanks so much for being with us, and we'll be back in a moment. 100 days and counting until the midterm elections. A sterling opportunity for our CBS News Battleground Tracker and our first estimate of where the battleground control for the House of Representatives stands. Republicans, who currently hold 214 of 435 seats and are in the minority, would take over control in the House by anywhere from a narrow majority to a sizable one if the election were held today. Our best estimate at the moment is 230 seats. Joining us now to explain all of this is CBS News Elections and Surveys Director Anthony Salvanto. Anthony, okay, that number 230 sticks in our mind, but what is the largest reason that it looks like it might be 230?
Morning, John. So let's start by reminding people that there are 435 separate contests going on this fall. And we interviewed people across all those districts and put it into this model to show you that in terms of seats, which is what matters. Now, the first thing you notice is that most seats don't flip. That's typical. But there is a narrow band in which we're going to trade in this range. And that's what's really important to watch. Now, these seats that could swing back and forth, they're sort of these prevailing political winds, if you will. And this election seems like it's really influenced by what we might call the nature of the times, which is that a lot of people think that the country is moving in the wrong direction, that things aren't good. And that's not only the most important thing voters are telling us that's on their minds, but it's also that Republicans are winning those voters. And so that's really impacting those seats.
And so the nature of the times is often associated with the president. The president is often, Joe Biden wouldn't like this, but it's often seen as a referendum on the presidency. So what does the survey tell us about Joe Biden and the role he's playing in the election?
Yeah, a president's always on the ballot in a midterm, and even if he's not really on the ballot, he's on voters' minds. That's certainly the case here. He's a big motivator for Republicans, and that's pretty typical because a president's party typically loses seats in a midterm. For them, it's another bite at the apple. They get to vote again, if you will, after 2020. Now, the important thing, though, that leads to is Biden suffered some lower approval even among Democrats. And that's dampening enthusiasm among Democrats. And that's going to lead to another problem for the party right now, which is perhaps lower turnout from his base.
So Republicans are angrier about the way things are happening now. They're turning out and they don't like the president. So the Democrats, remind me again what they feel about Joe Biden and what do they feel about Donald Trump, who used to motivate them quite strongly?
Yeah, so there are a couple of things. One is if they're disappointed with Joe Biden, they may sit this out, is what they're telling us. You look at key parts of the Democratic constituency. For one, just one example, young people, far less enthusiastic about voting than older Americans. That makes the electorate favor the Republicans right there if that Democratic base doesn't show up. Then let's mention the former President Trump. It's interesting, he is just as much of a motivating factor as Joe Biden. He's still on Democrats' minds, even though he's out of office. So for Republicans, they see him as a positive. They actually think that former President Trump is fighting for their issues more than their party in Congress. Clearly still seen as a leader of the party in that regard. But then for Democrats, he's a net negative. So that's something I think to watch. Do Democrats keep talking about him as we go forward? Because he does motivate Democrats.
Right, so Donald Trump is motivating both parties.
Yeah.
Have the January 6th hearings played a role, or do they, in your survey data?
Well, in some sense, Democrats are watching it more, so they're kind of preaching to the converted. What you do see is as Republicans have tuned out these hearings, there's a bit of a split. There's the Republicans who consider themselves MAGA Republicans. That's just over half the party, right? They're very close to the former president. They not only tuned it out, but some of them actually wish the president had succeeded in doing what they think he was trying to do and stay in office. But there's a slight number of Republicans who are watching this, and you see a little bit more hesitancy among them about their vote choice. So marginal differences matter, and I think that's going to be one of the keys going forward if some Republicans peel off as a result of this.
Another focus in the political world, other than the January 6 hearings recently, has been the decision on Roe versus Wade. A lot of Democrats, pundits, thought this would energize the Democratic base. What does the survey say?
Well, let's look at women under 50, because that's a key part of the Democratic base. They consider abortion to be just as important as other big issues, like the economy, like inflation. They also believe that a Republican Congress would make things overall worse for women. And they describe the Republican Party as extreme. But there's a cross pressure here, which is that they don't see the Democrats as effective, and they don't think that the Democrats are doing enough right now to protect abortion rights. So they're not necessarily seeing the answer from the Democrats, and that at the moment has the Democrats not doing as well with that group as they have in past elections.
So does that mean they have an opinion about Republicans, but it doesn't mean they're going to be motivated to necessarily vote on it?
Right, because they have to get an answer from the Democrats, and they're not seeing that right now.
Inside that question of women, college-educated women, that was a group the Democrats did well with. How is the Democratic Party doing now?
Worse than they have in previous elections, and that is so important. Those numbers are down. They think that the Republican Congress would make things worse for women in the country, but concerned about the economy, very concerned about the direction of the country, and all of those things are factoring in, too. This is going to be one of the keys, if not the key groups, to watch through the fall.
The final, quickly, Anthony, is the Democrats think they have a spending bill that's about to pass through the Senate. Will that help their fortunes in the next 100 days?
People will reason from results. They'll reason from what they see at the cash register and the gas pump, not necessarily from legislation, right? And we see that. When people say they're personally affected, they're less enthusiastic about voting for Democrats. So they've got, 6 to 8 weeks to see if they can turn that idea around in people's minds.
All right, Anthony Salvanto, thanks so much as always, and we'll be right back. We're back with our political panel. Asma Khalid covers the White House for NPR. Jonathan Martin is senior political correspondent for the New York Times and the co-author of This Will Not Pass. Ramesh Ponnuru is the editor of the National Review, and Robert Costa is our own chief election and campaign correspondent. It's great to have you all here. I'll start with you, Ramesh. What did you take away from this polling that Anthony just talked about?
Well, there were a lot of interesting findings in that poll, but the thing that stuck out most to me was the asymmetry in enthusiasm, that Republicans are more excited, opponents of this administration are more enthusiastic about showing up to vote. That's a pattern that we usually see in midterms. It's the reason why I think we've had so few periods of unified government in the last 50 years, that the public turns against whoever's in power in the White House.
Asma, you cover the White House. Joe Biden has talked about, I'm going to get out into the country, but Ramesh is talking about a country that may not, or a party that may not want to see him. So what's the thinking? Get him out there because to build enthusiasm, or keep him at home because that won't work?
Well, I do think the plan is to get him out there once sort of this COVID sweep clears. But I think the thinking is, I mean, we look at this past week, there are a couple of legislative wins that Democrats have had. And I do think that the party, the White House, believes that by going out on the road and selling some of these legislative accomplishments, they can boost the base. But I think that this is a challenge. I mean, I saw the enthusiasm thing too, Ramesh, and to me, what I was struck with in particular was, you talk about young voters. Sure, they never really show up in a midterm cycle, but they actually did show up in record numbers in 2018. Their enthusiasm has completely fallen off for Biden. You see it in polling. I've heard it when I go out on the road. They're just not excited about it.
It's fallen off. In 18, it might have been inspired by Donald Trump. Jonathan, Anthony's polling showed no one turns him out like Donald Trump in both parties. So
it's remarkable the codependence on Donald Trump within the Democratic Party is sort of 7 years and counting now, in which Donald Trump has offered the best mobilization, the best fundraising, and just the best overall grassroots energy for the Democratic Party, John. And Democrats quietly sort of need that to get their voters out in an otherwise difficult election year for them. I mean, those numbers among younger voters in the survey are so striking. And I think a big part of the reason, John, that Biden's approval rating is below 40% nationally is because of the drop-off in his own party. You're only below 40 in these kind of polarized times if you're losing some folks on your own home team. I think that's a huge part of their challenge, keeping those folks energized. And it's why the climate deal, I think, could be important. That was hatched this past week for getting more energy infused into the sort of ranks of younger Democratic voters who they desperately need this fall.
To build on that point, it's an important one. I remember when I first started covering Leader McConnell years ago, the person who would stop by more than anybody, it seemed, was then Vice President Joe Biden. He was the deal maker. And when I would talk to voters in 2020, on the Democratic side, they said they wanted to elect a deal maker who could make Washington work. And so you do wonder, as the campaign season heats up, can that deal-making aspect of Biden, someone who from the White House shepherds a deal between Senator Manchin and Senate Democrats, can he get traction with voters who see Washington as dysfunctional?
Ramesh, we're going to go back to the absolute base level of politics, but let's talk about policy for a second. As Bob's mentioning, there's some deals here that the president may or may not have been involved in, but what do you make of the legislative record and bipartisan legislative record between guns, infrastructure, maybe now, semiconductors? What do you make of just the legislative record so far?
I think that the legislative record is very impressive measured against a baseline of a 50-50 Senate. The legislative record is extremely disappointing measured against the baseline of the expectations that liberal Democrats had going into 2021 when they had the House, the Senate, and the White House, and there were grand ambitions. And one of the reasons for that drop-off in support and the demoralization of Democrats is exactly that gap, and that's what they've got to solve between now and November.
You were saying, yeah.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I mean, look, I think Biden sees these victories, John, as his rationale for why my party needs me. I came here and said I can make the system work, get deals done across the aisle. Gosh darn, I've done it. Who else can do that? And by the way, also not so subtly, he's saying, who else can beat Trump as well? You know, I think there's some Democrats who would sort of have this West Wing style fantasy in which Biden signs these bills into law. He puts down the pen and kind of does the reverse LBJ of after a sort of period of great success. He says, and with that, I'm going to fulfill my pledge to be a bridge president. The gate is open and let the bridge fill up. And that's just never going to happen because we know Joe Biden. He's going to take from this success, John, I think, affirmation that my party and my country needs me. I can get these kind of deals done in the Congress. I can take on Trump again. I alone, if you will, can do this. Yeah, exactly.
Asma, one thing that President Biden said this week when he was asked about a recession, the economy's on everybody's mind, he said he didn't see one. Is that a wise thing to do, to get into a big debate about the recession, or do they assume there's going to be people talking about the recession? We might as well try and get in that conversation.
I was struck a lot by this. I mean, all week long we had the White House, some of the economic advisors at the White House reaching out to, you know, White House reporters like myself, economic reporters, to preemptively essentially squash some of the bad news that we knew was going to happen. But I do think, to your point, I mean, many of the economists that I was speaking with this week will say, no, we don't see a recession at this particular moment. But in the same breath, they've said, we don't know. We might be in a recession in 6 months, particularly, you know, if the Fed really does raise interest rates too quickly. To me, it was a dangerous argument to make because, you know, it will be played on repeat later if the country is in a recession in 6 months. I understand the political need to essentially alleviate concerns. I mean, nobody wants to hear, I think, in the country right now that we're in a recession, but it's dangerous because 6 months out, frankly, even before the midterms, this country could be in a recession.
Bob, is anybody talking about the economy from the Democratic side who's making a case that is, in all of its complexity, but makes the case essentially to voters, you're going to want us in the future instead of the other team?
When I'm out there on the campaign trail, it's evident that there's not necessarily an enthusiasm gap, but a messaging gap. Are the Democrats explaining what they've done? $1.9 trillion in March of 2021. Then they pass an infrastructure bill. Now they have this climate and tax and deficit reduction package they're pushing forward. But is that breaking through to the voters it needs to connect with? It's not entirely clear. And they're also talking about foreign policy in terms of the economy. I mean, this is a former chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, now sitting there in the Oval Office as China becomes more aggressive with Taiwan. That's the variable I'm also watching ahead of the midterms, both politically, on policy, and economically. What does China do, and how does President Biden respond?
Ramesh, do you think, let's imagine this gets through, Manchin, Schumer, and Sinema comes along. Does that, in the end of the day, matter, or is it, you know, for every day between now and election, people are going to be still seeing higher prices, and what's your assessment of its political effect?
People don't wait to hear from the media or the NBER whether they're in a recession. If most people's paycheck is going, you know, is not going as far as it used to, and that is true, they're going to think this is a recession. They're going to think this is a bad economy, and they're going to hold the party in power accountable. This administration, I think, has consistently played the politics of the economy badly. First, in denying that inflation was going to happen, denying it was going to stick around, and now getting into this absurd definitional argument about whether we're in a recession or not. I think that is going to actually slightly compound the problem by making them also look out of touch.
Jonathan Martin, the Senate, let's look at the Senate first of the two. How do the races look there? And this was supposed to be a favorable year for Republicans. How's it turning out?
Well, the wind is certainly blowing in their direction, as it often does, John, in the first midterm of a president of the opposite party. But I think in Senate races and gubernatorial races, candidates do still matter. They don't matter as much in House races, which is more of a parliamentary referendum on the red versus blue and who's in power. I think it does matter more who the candidate is on the ballot when you're talking about gov and Senate races. And in that department, Republicans are having real challenges because they've nominated candidates who, in some cases, are out of the mainstream. In other cases, just have more baggage than O'Hare during the summer, and that can create, obviously, some challenges. The third point, John, I would add is the finances. A lot of these GOP candidates are going to be welfare cases, which is always a problem in the Republican Party, Ramesh, and they're going to need a bailout from a lot of these super PACs. The great irony of our times, this cycle at least, is that the Donald Trump-backed candidates for Senate and Gov are going to require bailouts financially from people like Mitch McConnell and the old guard who they ran against.
Let's not forget, the Republicans are not focused everywhere on the economy. You look at Pennsylvania's gubernatorial nominee, Doug Mastriano, an election denier. Out in Arizona, Kerry Lake, an election denier. This is pervasive in the GOP across the country. And I'm really watching Ohio's Senate race. Can Tim Ryan, a populist Democrat, actually beat J.D. Vance in a tough year? And can John Fetterman, running for Senate in Pennsylvania, upset Dr. Oz in a state that went for Trump back in 2016?
And I'm also curious how Democrats are really able to capitalize on the Dobbs decision, because this is something to me that's very unclear. I mean, Kansas, we were talking about that earlier, that Kansas is this place where voters are going to have a chance just this week to vote on a constitutional amendment to change abortion rights in the state. I sat down with the VP shortly after the decision came out, and she told me, this is something that she has personally been going out to states, North Carolina, Indiana, where it's not entirely settled law yet. I don't know that any of us really know how it's going to play out.
The polling shows that it's not working. In other words, Democrats think the White House isn't doing the job in making the case.
I think that they haven't sufficiently done a good enough job yet. But I think it's the one thing that Democrats could, if they want to shift the conversation away from the economy, this is a salient issue to do that on, if they can figure it out.
And just real fast, to plug our book shamelessly, This Will Not Pass. You can still buy it now. We have a conversation with Mitch McConnell on the night of January 6th, in which he vowed to crush Trump in the primaries this year. The opposite happened in a lot of these states, John. Trump-backed candidates won. Dr. Oz, J.D. Vance, perhaps Blake Masters in Arizona, and now it's on McConnell to help them out financially.
30 seconds.
If the wave is sufficiently strong for the Republicans, it can carry flawed candidates to victory. But the trouble is that it's going to take more resources. And some of these candidates are going to take more resources from the National Republican Party, from conservative donors all over the country, and thus that money won't be able to get other gettable races across the finish line.
Okay, Republican wave lifts all leaky boats. Thank you to all of you for being with us. We're out of time. Thank you all out there for joining us. We'll be back in just a moment. That's it for us today. Thank you for watching. Margaret will be back next week. For Face the Nation, I'm John Dickerson.